Yes, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here today and to see what the Aarhus JS community looks like. Now I want to talk to you about getting started with Next.js and server rendering your React. And I forgot to mention I'm Thomas, but you already introduced me, so that's fine. But what I need to introduce is the small company I work for. That's called Canoe. We are Aarhus based, and Canoe is kind of giving me the opportunity to talk here today too, because we are actually very passionate about that topic, because we try to help people with digital products that are have a small footprint and that value time and resources of the user. So, I mean, you probably, this is all something we can agree on that you should do, but we really try to stick to that. We try to build solutions that are for humans, so try to do it user-centered, ask users, and using solid technology, and I will come to that later, why server rendering is one of these choices that you should make. And we also try to make everything future-proof so that it's maintainable and you can see later what you've done and you're not like being very confused about that. And there are some technologies we work with. I have a slide where all the logos are shown. And the ones I want to talk to you about now are also on this slide, and that's basically Next.js and React. So the outline of that talk is very small, actually. Two main topics. So why should you server render? And how could you do that? And of course, your questions about that. First of all, I would like to ask you a question, or actually two. And for that, I will try to show your answers on the screen, actually. Let's see if that works. So if you have, let's do it like that. Yeah. So if you have a phone, you can now respond to my questions. And my first question is, have you heard about server-side rendering? And yeah, so that we can get a little picture of how the knowledge is already distributed. I'm not quite sure how you see the question. Or what do you mean?
The order of the answers they were a bit out of order.
Inside the app?
Yeah.
Like inside the website? Yeah, sorry about that. But thanks for the feedback. I'm just trying out the free account of that software, so maybe I configured something in the wrong way. I don't know. But I think that's a pretty nice picture, so we can see that everyone has heard about it, and that's a good condition for starting. And the second question should be in the same. Yeah, that's contrast and accessibility. I can't see the arrow to get to the next question. I can use the keyboard. Great. I hope you can see that question too, and the answers are not in a weird order. So that's about if you would consider using server-side rendering. And then we're going to compare afterwards. Okay. So I can stop now. You're already doing it, or we want it. Okay, great. Thanks for giving the responses. So let's start with why, and that's like a little tale about web performance, because I travel a lot because I like to travel, and I use trains mostly in Europe. And you might have used Wi-Fi on trains. It's kind of flaky, not really good. And that's something where you sometimes have a experience like that. You see 25 seconds of white screen, and then nothing happens. And before you give up, then at some point suddenly the website appears. And this is actually a screenshot from an article of Jake Archibald. I hope I'm not completely messing up the name. Who's, I think, working on Chrome. Who just for fun tested some Formula One websites, and it turned out that Ferrari wasn't the fastest on the web. They took a little while, and then after some 27 seconds you could see something. But I mean, to be fair, he found then out that the page had some 1.8 megabyte horse in the Ferrari logo that was embedded in the SVG. So it was also render blocking scripts, but it was also the horse. But it can easily boil down to not delivering content at the very moment I request it. And that's where your first meaningful pain and time to interactive, you probably heard about that, comes into play. And my point is that you shouldn't rely on JavaScript for that to happen. Because downloading the bundle, the JS, can be expensive. Not everyone has the fastest internet connection. Not everyone has a flat rate on their internet connection. Even on a train, you have like a 200 megabyte limit. After that, you're even slower than before. And then also, sometimes I also forget about that. Interpreting the JavaScript on the phone or on the computer is also expensive. It takes battery power, and it takes away time of the user. And also, JS can simply fail, like downloading a bundle can fail, or you can have errors in your JavaScript. And just for comparison, I looked up the average download speed from the 2017 AKMI report, which says that it would take about 3 seconds to download 2 megabytes of website, which is pretty big, but still a lot of websites are above 2 megabytes. So that's not very fast. But to be clear about what is actually the difference between server-side rendering and client-side rendering, these are not terms that are defined by W3C or something. They're just used like that, but essentially it boils down to, if you're rendering on the client, you load an basically empty HTML file. That's where you see the white page. Then it loads the assets like JS files. And then it paints your website once everything's there and ready to go. That's very simplified, of course. There are ways to improve that, and many people do that. But a different approach is then having the server deliver some initial HTML which actually makes sense, which contains some content. So that directly after you deliver stuff, you can show something and render it. And then after that, you load some JavaScript, and then you enhance the experience. And it's actually pretty impressive that so many people rely on client-side rendering when we look at how fail-safe the different web technologies are. So if you consider HTML, that's pretty fail-safe. It's just displaying text when it doesn't understand something. If you consider CSS, it has some weird quirks when it doesn't understand something, but it mostly works. If you consider JavaScript, if something doesn't work, the whole JavaScript breaks mostly. And I'd like to, or I like this metaphor of lift versus elevator, versus escalators, where you could say that when you're running out of power, then you can still use the escalators while the lift would be stuck. So you want something that has a fallback, that's not broken when the underlying level of energy or whatever, in our case JavaScript, or delivering the file, is gone. And there have been some ideas in JavaScript to recover from fatal errors. React has introduced something that's called error boundaries, which is pretty interesting. Then you can at least see an error message or some known good state when you run into an error inside a component. There's also try-catch, of course, which you can use and which can be understood by browsers. And you can think of all kinds of other clever fallbacks, but the easiest thing is just to deliver plain HTML. So that's what I just said. We can avoid being stuck in the lift by delivering the first, on the first load, a key experience for the user. For example, if you're creating a newspaper website, then it should be reading the article. That should be possible with just the HTML. Or if you're doing something like Twitter, then it would be reading tweets and tweeting, right? So that's the key features. And then you use progressive enhancement to add all the sugar that we want and expect from modern web apps. And also client-side navigation, so that when you click a link on the page, it doesn't refresh the whole page, but just gets the content and then displays it. So what we want is actually an approach that is best of both worlds. Server delivers something, and then the client also does something if they can. And I want to advertise for not making like a headache of that thing, and to use existing like setups, boilerplate stuff, because it can be very intimidating at first to get a JavaScript or Node server to spit out the right HTML to your browser. And then I also thought about, why is there actually such a focus on client-side rendering? And I'm not really sure about that. I haven't done any scientific research on that. But I think it's mainly because, as I said, it used to be very difficult to do server-side rendering. And for some use cases, it might actually be okay. If you're running a public display where you can't really interact with the website, it's totally fine to just render it on the client, because you know exactly where it's going to run. But as soon as you can't control the environment where it's working in, you should deliver some HTML. And also maybe because people just don't care, I don't know, maybe that's not really nice of me to say, but what I want to say is that it can be very frustrating for a user, and they can just leave your site. And some sites like Amazon.com or GitHub.com, they have totally realized that, and they work pretty much fine even without any JavaScript. You can shop on Amazon without having the bundle downloaded. So now we get to the part how we're going to implement that. And I would suggest starting with create NextStep, which is a command that's available for npx. And it will provide you with an example project where you can see some mechanics of using Next.js. And it's as simple as I mean, on a fresh machine, you would probably need to install Node.js. And then you would run npx create NextStep, change to that folder, and then either use npm start or yarn or whatever you use. And optionally, you can also use all other stuff that you want to use, like style components, TypeScript, but you don't have to. The example is very basic. And what I did is, I don't really know if that's going to work because you probably can't see it, but I will walk you through it. I made a recording of some setup that I did, and I will try to explain what's happening. So at this point, I ran the command npx create NextStep, and I'm now with my terminal in that folder. And then to get started, I run yarn dev or dev, like developer or development. And then I have a URL that I can go to. And then I can see, okay, my example NextStep is already working. And then I can start working on a new page, which I would call meetup.js now. I import React, and then I just exported default class, which will be our page. And all the pages in our NextStep, they are going to be in the pages folder. Right now we only have the index page, which corresponds to home, and now we're creating the meetup page. And there's one specific method in this class that we can define, and that's going to be called getInitialProps. And that's something Next.js helps you with. It will set up the props of your page or component, and it will do so on the server and on the client. So you don't need to write your code twice. And right now I'm just returning an empty object because we don't have any props yet. Then I'm going to the index page and copying the HTML that is in there, and also the CSS. You can of course include an external style sheet as well. And then I'm just going to copy it to that meetup file and make some changes, maybe indentation, very very important. I can't really skip, so that's the limitation of that method. But yeah, then I copy these imports at the top because we use some components that Next.js provides us with, like a link component, and then the head and navigation component is already in the example. So that's something you can also do custom, of course. And then I'm going to add the meetup page to the navigation by just copying this link node and changing the URL and title. And now that URL corresponds to the file name in the pages folder. So that at first it seems a little counterintuitive maybe if you've used something like React Router or something. But Next.js makes it really simple to get your routes up and running by just placing a file in the folder with a name. Of course, you can get to more exciting use cases, but that's basically how you get started. And now we can, of course, click the meetup, and then you can see that we can switch between the pages. And what I did then is I looked at meetup.com, and they have an API. So we can get some data about our today's meetup maybe. So I began creating a function that's called, I don't know what it's called, but we're going to see. That's going to fetch some data from the API. And that data we will then display on the page. Fetch events. So take away from that, I need to somehow speed this up maybe when I don't have anything to say. But you get the point. Now we are just going to use the fetch method. Paste in some URL where I actually had to pass that through a different service where it adds some cross-origin headers, because Meetup apparently doesn't want to add them. And then we pass the JSON response, and then there's a note on the response that's called results, and in that we'll have a list of events. And now we can use this function in our getInitialProps method to return the events prop, and then we're basically done. Then I'm adding a console or log statement so that we can now see that this method is actually run on the server and the client. It's weird because I don't see the video here. That's a Keynote specialty. And now we can see there's an error actually. Fetch is not defined. So that's because fetch is only something that exists in the browser. It doesn't exist in Node.js. So that's something you have to be aware of when you use the getInitialProps method. You can't use something that only exists in one of the environments. You always have to put something in that works in both. So I've been installing the isomorphic fetch module that works on both sides and uses whatever is available. And now we can see in the terminal that our console log statement gives us a list of events, and also in the browser we also get that. It only has one event, which is today, but that should be fine for a demo. Next, we can display the events. So I'm just going to change the title of the page and remove some stuff. And then I'm going to map over the events. And then I want to show, I don't know if you remember from the homepage of the example, there were 3 boxes. And then my plan is to show a box for each event, which would be 1 now with this API response, but could be more if there are more events. We need to add a key to every element in our map method that's React specific, so that React can reuse the elements that we map over. And doesn't get confused with what happens to elements that are no longer in use. And then there's some HTML in the API response for some reason, and I'm just putting it lazily in as dangerously set in HTML. You shouldn't do that in production. But just for the sake of this example, and we have the date. Code faster. And then I also output the location of the event. It's actually pretty interesting that this information is completely public. I mean, everyone can use that API and see what events we have.
You can also just go on the website and
yeah, but it's actually harder to find on the website than it is through the API, I find. Then I'm going to, now we can see here that the output is ready. We can now change between the pages, and we see that here we see our April meetup event with all the description that's in there. And now you probably want to see some proof that it actually server renders, and it does. If you look at the source code, we can see that our April meetup H3 is in there and the paragraph too. So when we deliver something from the server, we already have the finished site, and when we then click between home and meetup, it doesn't reload the page because we're using the link component from Next.js, and then Next.js just takes care of navigating between the pages and deciding, is this a server render or is it just a change of pages? And it always calls the getInitialProps method. So quick recap. So we used create NextStep to get started. Then we can also use TypeScript if we want. We can use styled components, so we can use anything we want. But of course we have to use React because that's what Next.js works with. And we can easily share our code for fetching events from a REST API between client and server, and then have server-side rendering out of the box. And that was a quick walkthrough, and I would be ready for your questions before we get to my question, where we take the same survey again. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to shout out now. Yes?
So there's something about the initial load, right? You want to keep it below, is it 14K or something like this for the packet to fit inside the TCP? So is there some easy way of seeing how much your initial load would be? Could it automatically cut away some of the content and just render the boxes? Or
Yeah, so the question was, I'm repeating for the video, is there a way to fit the server response automatically into a certain threshold that would allow to have it all in one packet? Yeah, have it all in one packet. I don't really know, but if you're hosting your Node.js, Next.js server, then you're probably going to use some kind of system around it. So you're either using a hosting provider that can handle Node.js, or you're using some kind of Nginx or something like that, and maybe you can configure it there already. But maybe you can also write something in plain Webpack configuration then, because Next.js uses a predefined Webpack configuration and you can extend that. So maybe you can do something there. But it's a really good question. I haven't actually thought about making it that small. But yeah, it's really a good point.
I think one way to solve that would be that you manually, of course, identify the components that are below the fold so that the user doesn't see, and then you don't render them on the server, you just leave them empty, and then you just load everything above the fold on your server-side render. Then you're always, and if that goes over 14K, then you're just fucked. There's no way of handling that gracefully.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything you want to add, or? No. Great, then I'll take.
This is a follow as well. I'm pretty passionate about the static site generation as well.
Yeah.
So what you can do is exactly what you were saying. You can do like the skeleton sites, where you just render. Anybody has seen these, if you look at Facebook or Twitter, like colored boxes where there's supposed to be content, and these can actually be done to reduce the initial page size down to something that can fit in a TCP package. I've seen some guys do that deliberately. Like the content can be fetched server side, but they deliberately don't do it because they want it to refresh for the client when it arrives there. So they just ship a skeleton site instead. That's like one way to do it.
Yeah. So you were saying you can ship a skeleton site that then is small enough to fit in one packet. But I also think that then you might be losing some advantage of server-side rendering because you want to get the content to the user, of course. it's a small balance between how small can I get with my response and how much can I deliver in that response. Yes?
Is there a way to like programmatically index, like bail out of server-side rendering and say this component and all its children should not be server-side rendering? Like, is there a magic prop you can put on, or is there something like
Yeah, I mean,
personalization stuff? Typically, you might want to put a CDN in front of this,
yeah.
so you want the server-side render version to be generic,
Yes.
that everybody can see the same thing. But then it says low filtered when you run this.
Yeah. Yeah.
That really makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
So can you turn it off for part of the site or something?
So the question is, can you turn off server-side rendering for specific components? You can, and we're actually doing that too when we're using Next.js. There is a prop that gets passed to the getInitialProps method that's called isServer, I think. And then you can, of course, pass that down and use it in your components and then say, if isServer, then do that, and otherwise do that. So that's easy. Yes?
So this kind of forces you to use class components, right? Is there like a hooks variant for that?
I think so. The question is, Next.js forces does Next.js force you to use class components?
At least on the page level for everything that has server-side.
Yeah. So I'm not 100% sure about that because your question is about the page level, right? Of course, you can use, for example, function components and also the new use what's it called? Use effect or use hooks within your components. I think Next.js already has support for that. But I'm not sure about the page level. So it's possible that you need to have one done, maybe you know.
So you should be able to use just pure functional components, and then they enable you to do the name of that component, and then .getInitialProps, and then you should be set. So you are able to do
okay.
functional components as well.
Okay.
But on the pages level.
Yeah.
So you have to, everything that you want to do with server-side rendering has to be loaded on the page level. That's ridiculous. So that would for me mean I would not use that because that breaks componentization completely.
Not really, because I mean, so let's recap. So you can use function components or simple components on the page level, and then the follow-up question was, so you can only use server-side or getInitialProps on the page level, and that's true, but it kind of supports either the flow of drilling down props, or if you want, you can also provide your initial props to a Redux store and then use them in subsequent components.
Who uses Redux nowadays?
Well, it's your choice what stack you use.
So the use case I'm currently thinking of is that I maybe have in some form deep down there's a drop down. The list of the options comes from the web.
Yeah.
And I want to server-side render this.
Mm.
And I don't want to pass down everything, and I also don't want to be forced to use Redux.
Yeah.
But there's other.
Maybe then it's just not the right tool for you. I think
there's other
yeah,
ways of doing it.
precisely. Yeah. There was another question.
No, I just use Redux.
Okay. Yeah, I use Redux too. No, it's fine. We didn't want to get into library conflicts, right? So, yeah. Any more questions?
Have you ever experimented with other server-side rendering?
Yeah, of course. So I've been using just my own configuration for server-side rendering, where you use React's render to string method, and then you put a whole lot of engineering on top of that to get a real website. But beside from that, I haven't tried any other frameworks. Any more questions? Then yeah.
So
Yes, you have. So the question is, do you have control about the head of the document? And there is a special page that's called _document that you can create. And then you can define your document template, for example, for setting the page language in your HTML tag, or creating a custom head. Great. So then I have one last question for you, if you're interested. I will try to... It's a different survey, because I'm restricted to 2 on the free version. So now I want to check if the result is still the same, or if you're now horrified or or really happy about it. It looks almost the same. We compare. Okay, some people left, I guess. So this is new, this is old. It's great. No hasn't increased, so that's great. That's my goal.
Just look at that.
Exactly. Great. Thank you very much.